Welcome to the latest Gramophone podcast. I'm Martin Cullingford, editor of Gramophone, and I'm delighted to be joined today by violinist Daniel Hope to explore American music. Daniel, hello.
Hi there, Martin. Nice to be with you.
Now, I've thoroughly enjoyed your new Deutsche Grammophon album, which explores, as I say, America's rich musical heritage through arrangements of works by Leonard Bernstein, Sam Cooke, Aaron Copland, Duke Ellington, George Gershwin, Florence Price, Samuel Warden, Kurt Weill. Many names there which immediately conjure up an evocative image of so many facets of American life and culture of the past century. So let's begin with a both fascinating but fiendish question. Can we define American music? What is it that gives these works a shared identity?
Well, I think it is difficult to really define America as it is American music, but I think that for the one part, American music is defined by the American way of life, and that means the flexibility and the invention that has always been in that country has always penetrated the music. And at the same time, the music is so diverse in terms of where it comes from. And what I wanted to do with this album was to dig a little bit deeper and try and follow some of those trails and to pay homage to a country that has been extremely good to my family, taking in an enormous amount of our relatives who, for the most part, escaped Germany. And the idea of the music that was created by immigrants and by people coming into the United States and embracing American culture is also fascinating. You know, somebody like a Kurt Weill, who from the second he got off the boat was American, to such an extent that he called himself Weill and not Vile. There was something that happened to people arriving in that country, specifically at that time, I think, that was a game changer for music. And that was what I was trying to get to the bottom of.
So, running through much of the programme, you used the word inventing before. That sort of perfectly leads us on to jazz. I mean, it's a genre whose relationship to classical music is always a fascinating and fruitful one. In some ways, they're closely related, and in others, so very different. And it's in figures like Gershwin and much of the rest of this repertoire that those two worlds are wonderfully brought together, as you've done on this album. And when you play this music, are you playing jazz, or is jazz joining you, or is such a question a rather redundant one? Perhaps that dialogue that I've described is actually really what's at the heart of jazz.
I think there are a number of different answers to that. For this particular arrangement of the Gershwin song suite, we were joined by Marcus Roberts, Jason Marsalis, and Rodney Jordan. These are three of the finest jazz musicians out there. And the idea that we had, I've known Marcus now for almost 20 years, and the two of us helped to run the Savannah Music Festival for 16 years. He was principally for jazz and I was there for classical music. And we had these run-ins throughout the years where we got together and we would play together and we would try things out. And over these years, we started talking about the idea of a collaboration involving an orchestra and getting the two worlds to coexist. What we didn't want was some kind of a gimmick where, you know, I would improvise a few phrases, he would wait and then do his thing. We wanted to try and find a way where both of the worlds are represented. The idea of improvisation and freestyle, but also a structural string sound, and to examine the idea of what actually is jazz. You know, Charlie Parker said jazz is not just music, it's a way of life. And if you look at where jazz comes from, you know, the fact that you have these protest songs, the spirituals, and you have the blues, and you have this music that has come out of slavery, out of a people that know that they have a place in society, even though they're not allowed one, and they choose the language of music to represent that. The fact that that amalgamates into jazz, I think, is an absolutely fascinating starting point. If you then look at George Gershwin, who comes in from the sort of singer-songwriter, sort of almost sunny boy, can do anything, picks up a song and turns it into a hit. Then again, you narrow the fields of expression that were taking place in the 1920s, 30s. You've got the emergence of ragtime, you've got the different Dixie bands, you've got the New Orleans jazz. So all of this is going on and it's marching forward into something that meets in the middle. And I do think that there's a European element there, because you've got the Django Reinhardts, you've got the swing coming in principally from Europe, and it's meeting at some point. And that moment, that defining moment that we call jazz, is the birth of a universal language which belongs to everybody, actually. But the core of it is the African American. That's the most important part of it. And so I think that with Gershwin, you have a sense that you're almost looking in every different direction, because he's able to pull in the elements of all of these things and create something that is deeply American. And it's for the first time I would really call it American, because it represents all of the cultures.
How easy to you did playing jazz feel when you first started doing it, that sense of improvisation and freedom? Obviously your background was that of a classical person learning music through the score, and though there's obviously so much interpretive freedom within that, the parameters are set much more than they obviously are with jazz. I remember once talking to another violinist who said the first time they encountered stage fright was when they suddenly realized they had to improvise, which was something they'd not encountered before. I mean, how do you find that?
Well, I was incredibly lucky, because when I started to learn the violin with Sheila Nelson, the first thing that she taught us was to improvise. She had a thing called Cowboy Chorus, where she would line us all up in a circle, and then she would play on the piano or on a violin, she would play a melody, and you had to pick up that melody on the note on which it finished, improvise it and pass it on to your partner. And you went around and you weren't allowed to break the circle. And so the first thing you learned was how to intuitively continue a phrase without watching the music. When I was about 15, I started to study Indian music. And I did that for about 20 years, where you spend the first couple of years nowhere near a page, but just trying to come to terms with the structures of the ragas, the succession of the notes, and how you can then improvise by keeping that structure. So by the time I got to playing with Marcus and other jazz musicians, I was certainly not a jazz player, but the idea of improvisation was very, very comfortable for me, as it is now. I tend to improvise, though, in a more, let's say, folk music sort of style. If you put me into a folk band, I can go on for hours. With jazz, I'm very much aware of the structures in which they operate, and therefore I'm much more reticent and much more respectful. And then when you've got somebody like Marcus Roberts, who could just go off on these tangents, which is mind-blowing. Not to mention Jason Marsalis, who one of the finest drummers in the world, who is keeping you and him and everybody in check. There's such a rigidity going on there. And Marcus said to me, we get a lot of stick because people think we're just random. We just turn up and play what we want. He said, but it's not like that. It's very structured, and it is. So it's a long way to answer your question, but I felt very comfortable, but also extremely cautious to start with, just to listen what was going on. And we played these arrangements for several years in different combinations until we really felt this was the time to put it down on tape.
And the other musicians you're joined with, the Deutsche Grammophon Orchestra, an ensemble you've led since 2016. I mean, how important in this repertoire was it for you to be with musicians that you know intimately and have such an instinctive rapport with?
It was absolutely essential. I can't really imagine having done it with musicians that one doesn't know. However great they are, you have to have that feeling. And, I direct the Zurich Chamber Orchestra from the violin. We don't have a conductor. So it's like playing chamber music. It always has been. Even the symphonies we do, we all do, conductorless. And I trust the musicians implicitly, and I love playing with them. And they just grow and grow, and we grew together as a team. So they were very up for it. They were also reticent at the very beginning. I remember the first sort of rehearsals and stuff where they were unsure, where do we come in? I mean, just basic things. When the trio goes off on a circle, on a cycle, do they do 2, 3, 4 versions of it? And some nights, in a particular heat of the moment, they would do another 2, and the orchestra would be waiting to come in, but wouldn't come in, and one has to let that go. But the interesting thing is also we started to change. We started to change the way we were playing, the sound we were making, the vibrato we were doing, the slides we were doing. We were reacting as much to the other side as they were to us. And that was really, I think, the inherent hope that I had for this piece was that you could have two worlds that coexisted without having to cheapen it or without having to take a step back from what those worlds are by just, having a go here and there, but actually really trying to create two sound worlds and showing it in quote-unquote classical George Gershwin string sound to a real jazz trio and the way they go. And, Marcus goes literally from bluegrass and gospel up to bebop, in a single phrase. He is Mr. Music, and you never know what's going to come next. And so that's very thrilling to experience.
Yes. And it's fascinating, really, to reflect based on what you've just said. Here we have an album which is one take of those or one recording of those works, which will evolve in different ways in different times depending on how things are going. I mean, when you recorded it, did you think, well, okay, we have to choose one, this is what we'll do? And how do you feel about the idea of sort of setting in stone, as it were, something which is very fluid? And you're on tour at the moment, and every night will feel different to a large extent.
I mean, that's the question I asked Marcus in the interview. I said, isn't it going against the definition of jazz? Because you create something new, you have to actually make that decision. This is what we're going to use as the take. And we were both in agreement, yes, that, it is a drawback because of the nature of it. At the same time, there are moments where you feel this is something I want to say. This is part of the language I'm trying to make happen. And you have to, for me, an album is always a starting point. It's never been the end. And always when I've done, whatever the projects I've done, I've got to that time where I say, now it's ready to let it go. You put it out there in the world, and then it starts to grow. And there are many, many spin-offs and inspirations and changes that then take place as they have done, let's say, in the Belle Epoque program, or even in the Air program. I've been playing for 25 years, and it still keeps changing. So it's a reference point at any given time, but it's also, let's say, another step in the journey.
But to maybe look at a few of the specific works on the programme. And obviously a large part of it is arrangement of song, which are things we're very used to hearing sung, but then also used to hearing in arrangements. And here you are playing them on your violin. Talk a little bit about the experience of playing these beautiful lyrical lines for an instrument and how you approach doing that.
Yes, it's a very important point, because most of these are songs, and somebody like me who grew up with West Side Story and listening to those famous lines, whether it's "What a beautiful girl in the world, Maria," just things like that, which you are then just repeating a single note, for example, is a challenge. But I was so enthused by the arrangements, and there I have to huge hats off to Paul Bateman, because I think he's not just a brilliant arranger, but he has understood the sonic worlds and the differences of the worlds that are here on the table. And it's a huge difference between a Kurt Weill and a Gershwin. There's a difference between a Gershwin and a Sam Cooke. These are very specific sound worlds, and we as listeners often know them and feel like we own them somehow, because everybody has their favorite interpretation or their favorite moment of listening to this song by this person. And so I in the end, I just went in there with this feeling of exuberance, I would say, because the arrangements were so lush and gave me such an opportunity to be flexible with the sound that I could really push the boundaries. And Kurt Weill is an interesting animal, because he's somebody that comes from the very uncompromising Drei Groschen Berlin 1928 world, which is extremely different to a September Song or My Ship. And yet he was able, the minute he got off that ship in New York, he said, I'm American and this is what I'm going to do. And a reporter asked him, why do you want to write American music? And he said, because I can. And then Marlene Dietrich meets him in Hollywood, and he's been told under pain of death by the studio to make sure he gets her for the movie. And she complains to him and says, why are you writing this music, this American music? Why does it not sound like it did back in Berlin? And he says, I interrupted her immediately. This rubbish that she was spouting. I'm an American now. This is American music. There's no point in continuing this conversation. That was it. There was this kind of almost Jekyll and Hyde personality there, that he realized this is what he had to do, this is what he could do, and this is what he was going to do. And so it's things like that get me thinking when I start to play September Song. There's a nostalgia in there which is not actually schmoozy and over the top. It's actually restrained, but it's very beautiful because it comes from a different perspective, a very analytical way of viewing American music, which is totally different from, let's say, in Irving Berlin or something like that.
And also works like September Song, so many other pieces on here, they really do show the strength of these melodies, because when arranged as they have been, they don't sound like you pretending to be a voice. They actually sound like beautiful lyrical melodies that work so well on an instrument.
I mean, this is just incredibly good music. There's no doubt of that. And from Weill to Gershwin, these tunes, as we call them, really defined American life for 30 to 40 years. The impact was enormous on American culture and on the culture of the world. And then when you add different elements into it, like swing, I specifically had the swing guitar for the Kurt Weill because I wanted to have that feeling of, his time in Paris, which was so important. The Second Symphony was writing, the Deadly Sins. Those are music that are kind of in transit. He's in transit. He's trying to find Mahagoni, actually. And America may be his Mahagoni, it may not be, but he's searching for that. And so the European elements he's pulling in because he can. And that's very different to let's say a Tin Pan Alley Gershwin. And if you listen to Gershwin playing, and there's a sort of a golden halo around the sound, even if it's almost 100 years old. There's something in there which is totally unique. By the way, if you hear him speak, I didn't realize there were interviews with him, and I just heard one today. There's 1934 radio shows where he talks a little bit about his music, and to hear the voice as well, it's amazing. It gives you my mind was spinning last night when I heard him, because I just come off stage and then you listen to him talking about his piano concerto and stuff and how he plays, and they say, what's your favorite piece? He says, of course, it's I Got Rhythm, and then he plays it. That was an amazing kick for me.
Yeah, I'll hunt that down. Another story running through the album, one sadder but at the same time full of hope, is that of music by African-American composers who are only now perhaps getting the due that their music so richly deserves. Someone like Florence Price, who's represented here by the very beautiful adoration that you play in an arrangement. I mean, tell me a little bit about the importance for you of discovering and giving a voice to figures like that.
I think it's incredibly important. And, about 10, 15 years ago, it was Thomas Hampson that started telling me about these composers, Florence Price, Margaret Bonds, William Grant Still, and he had spent so much time, and still does, devoted to song and to American song and where that comes from. And he was sending me all sorts of links of pieces. You've got to check this out, and let's do this. And then we did concerts together where we played William Grant Still. And so it was clear for me that if I was going to make a record, which I was even going to call America, that the African American foundation had to be major in terms of the music that was played and the people playing it as well. I am still deeply fascinated by the Dvorak question, as people call it. You know, this article and this 1893 interview that he gave at a time where it must have seemed very unusual for him to go out on a limb like that. And if you read the entire, it's often just quoted, but if you actually read the whole Herald interview and what he says, he's so convinced and so just into that mindset that the African American voice is the only American voice out there, actually. It goes far deeper than often in the quotes. And then if you look at the backlash that comes, and you look at Bruckner, for example, saying this is absolute nonsense, and you've got Josef Joachim and Anton Rubinstein saying this is actually quite interesting, and you've got suddenly everybody kind of popping up. The question is, where does this go? Is this just a white musicological sort of spat? But then you look not even 10 years later and you have the emergence of New Orleans jazz. So within 10 years, Dvorak is proved absolutely right. And so I guess part of me wanted to find out more about that in terms of what is the African-American expression within music. I mean, we know that they created jazz. We know that the blues and the spirituals, we know that the form of protest in the emotion is what led to the build-up of jazz. We know all of that. But there is also a European voice in there. And it's that amalgamation, perhaps because I'm an amalgamation of things as well, that just really fascinates me. And the question is, when did people start calling it just American music? And when was it not just black music? Or when was it not just hot swing? When was it actually jazz, a language that's available to everybody, that is our music? Bernstein talks about our music. This belongs to us. And Duke Ellington, for me, I think of all of those composers, was somebody that early enough stood up and embraced it all. And that's why I wanted to have a piece by him on the album. And come Sunday, Mahalia Jackson, I think if anyone's ever heard Mahalia Jackson sing that song with the kind of cadenza that she does beforehand, you never forget it. And so I asked Paul to come up with basically a kind of a homage to Mahalia Jackson and to Duke Ellington. But Duke Ellington is there in any case through his gorgeous harmonies. But it's about Mahalia Jackson, and it's about her demeanor and the power of her voice. And she was as important in that time as she was in apartheid South Africa. And my father would listen to Mahalia Jackson, had all the records. She represented the same things 30, 40 years later that Sam Cooke was singing about in the 60s. So it's all connected somehow, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating and beautiful album. So many musical and cultural and social threads drawn together. I really enjoyed it. Daniel Hope's new album, America, is available now on Deutsche Grammophon. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me to talk about it.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much, Martin.
An excerpt from Duke Ellington's Come Sunday in an arrangement by Paul Bateman, performed by our guest this week, Daniel Hope, and taken from his new album America, available now on the Deutsche Grammophon label. Thank you for downloading this Gramophone podcast. If you enjoyed it, there are many more episodes to be found. Simply search for Gramophone where you usually find your podcasts. And why not consider giving us a rating or even a review, which can really help other people find our podcasts too. The latest issue of the magazine, featuring an interview with our cover artist Joyce DiDonato, is available now, and if you'd like to subscribe to the magazine either in print or digitally, all listeners to our podcasts can get a 20% discount off any subscription package. Simply visit gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and enter the code podcast20 at the checkout. And do join us next week for another Gramophone podcast.